The rain had been falling for hours by the time the moving truck rattled up the long, uneven road that cut through the woods. The trees leaned close to the narrow lane, their limbs black and wet, forming an arch overhead. Beyond them, somewhere in the distance, the shape of the house waited. The headlights swept across dripping branches and the occasional glimpse of a sagging fence post. The road seemed older than the truck itself, worn into the earth by time. And as the family drew closer, there was a sense of moving deeper into a place that had been left behind by the rest of the world. The first sight of the house came as they rounded a bend. 3 stories of weathered wood and dark windows crouched at the far end of an overgrown lawn. Its roof line tilted in strange ways, as if the weight of years had pressed unevenly on its bones. The siding was a gray that might once have been white, streaked with the tracks of countless rains. Shutters hung crooked or were missing altogether. Yet there was something about its size, its stance on the land, that suggested it had been grand once. The wind whipped through the grass, carrying the smell of wet earth and old leaves. The front steps sagged underfoot as they climbed them, boots clunking against damp wood. The porch stretched across the width of the house, its floorboards soft with rot in places. The door, tall and heavy, bore a tarnished brass knocker in the shape of a lion's head, its mane worn smooth where countless hands had touched it. The hinges groaned when it opened, the sound echoing faintly into the cavernous interior. Inside, the air was still and cold. The foyer was broad, with a staircase rising sharply to the left. Faded wallpaper peeled from the walls in curling strips, revealing the lath beneath. A chandelier hung from the ceiling, its crystals dulled with dust. Beyond the staircase, the hallway stretched into shadow, the dim light from the outside barely touching the far end. Somewhere deeper in the house, a slow drip of water could be heard. The family began to move through the rooms, the sound of their footsteps muffled by thick dust and worn carpets. The parlor held a grand fireplace framed by cracked tiles, above which hung a long, narrow mirror, whose silvering had begun to dissolve into cloudy swirls. The dining room smelled faintly of mildew, its table long gone, but the outline of it still visible in the cleaner rectangle on the floor. The kitchen was a mismatched patchwork of ages. Some cabinets decades old, others clearly replaced in more recent years, though all were coated in a fine grit of neglect. As they explored, the sensation of the house's age pressed in on them. Every surface felt infused with the memory of years, worn smooth where hands had touched, stained dark where spills had sunk in, marked with scratches whose makers were long gone. The walls themselves seemed to hold the weight of something unspoken. Night fell quickly in the woods, and by the time the last boxes were carried inside, the sky had gone from gray to deep black. The house swallowed the light from the bare bulbs they switched on, as if the darkness lived in the walls and refused to retreat. They ate in the kitchen, the sound of cutlery against plates unusually loud in the stillness, their voices subdued without anyone realizing it. Upstairs, the bedrooms were wide and drafty, with tall windows that rattled faintly in the wind. The children's room still held the remnants of faded wallpaper, patterned with shapes too indistinct to identify. The parents' room was larger, its floor uneven, the boards creaking under each step. In the hallway between the rooms, the light bulb flickered when switched on, throwing shadows that shifted unnervingly along the walls. The first night was marked by the unfamiliarity of the place, the distant groan of timbers settling, the occasional faint tap somewhere inside the walls, the way the wind seemed to circle the house before slipping through unseen cracks. The air felt thicker here, as though it had not moved freely in years. In the hours before dawn, the rain eased and a deep silence took its place. It was in that silence, lying in the dark, that they first had the sense, too subtle to name, that the house was listening. Morning brought pale light through the windows and the distant sound of crows in the trees. They set about unpacking, the rooms slowly filling with the shapes of their lives, boxes stacked in corners, furniture angled to fit the oddities of the old floors, the hum of appliances beginning to mask the underlying hush of the house. The day passed quickly, and with each hour the house seemed to watch them settle in. By the second night, the temperature had dropped, the air carrying the damp bite of autumn. The darkness felt heavier, more complete. Somewhere in the walls there was a sound, so faint it could be mistaken for wind. But it did not rise or fall with the gusts outside. It was a thin, unbroken murmur, threaded beneath the creaks and sighs of the old wood. It was not speech, not yet, only the suggestion of breath moving in narrow spaces where no one should be. The family moved through the house, unaware that in certain corners, in the stillest hours, the walls had begun to whisper. The second night's strange murmur returned before the family had even gone to bed. It was clearer now, threading through the house in slow, measured waves, like something exhaled close to the ear, but coming from deep within the walls. At first, it was a background presence beneath the sound of boxes being unpacked and footsteps moving across the old floors. But the more they tried not to notice it, the more it seemed to press inward. Upstairs, in the dim hallway, the air felt thicker than it had during the day. The single bulb overhead gave off a faint orange light, haloed in dust, and every few moments it shivered faintly, as if reacting to something unseen. In the children's room, the draft from the window made the curtains shift against the glass, yet the sound from the walls was not in rhythm with the movement. It came in pulses, in syllables. At first, the voices were too soft to parse. Then one of them spoke a name. It did not belong to anyone who had lived here before, nor to any stranger. It belonged to the boy. The sound slid out of the wall directly beside his bed, shaping the word with an intimacy that made the air seem colder. The name was not shouted or groaned, but breathed, the way one might call across a room when they are already certain of being heard. Down the hall, another wall exhaled a different name. This time, it was the girl's. The whisper was so close it seemed to pass directly through the thin plaster and into the open space of the room. She froze in her bed, her blanket pulled to her chin, staring at the wall as though something might push its way through at any moment. The parents heard nothing at first, or thought they didn't, until the moment the mother passed the closed door of the old storage room at the end of the hall. The air there was cooler, and from the darkness beyond the threshold came the faintest susurration. Her name, repeated slowly, with pauses between as though the speaker were tasting the sound. She stepped back before she realized she had done so, her breath shallow, and hurried to their bedroom without looking behind her. That night, none of them slept well. The house had grown restless, And the murmurs were no longer confined to the far reaches of the night. They rose and fell in the hours just after sunset, when the outside light was draining away and the walls seemed to expand with the cold. They came again in the thin hours before dawn, when the silence was deepest and the air hung heaviest. By the third evening, it was impossible to pretend it was the wind. The voices did not move with the weather, did not shift with the air. They stayed in certain places, corners where the shadows pooled, walls that seemed thicker than they should be, ceilings where the plaster bulged faintly. In these places, the whispers called the names of the living, always the living, never repeating the same one twice in a row, but cycling through them with unhurried precision. Sometimes the tone was coaxing, other times drawn out and low, but it was always deliberate, always knowing. The sound carried the weight of something that did not guess or hope, but was certain of its subject. The cadence was wrong for human speech, too measured, too careful, and yet each name was perfectly clear. They began to avoid certain rooms after dark. The children refused to pass the door to the storage room without running. The mother found herself unwilling to linger in the kitchen after the sun had gone down, for there was a point in the far corner near the pantry where her name would rise from the wall as though someone were standing on the other side. The father, though unwilling to admit fear, caught himself taking the long way around the house at night rather than past the downstairs bathroom, where the voice that knew him seemed always to be waiting. The house responded to their avoidance with a subtle shift. The whispers began appearing in new places, filling spaces they thought safe. A narrow closet under the stairs, once just a dark hollow for coats, began breathing the girl's name in a long, thin hiss. The far corner of the parents' bedroom, where the plaster was cracked in a jagged line, began to shape the boy's name over and over with slow patience. Sleep came only in fragments now. The night was measured in the intervals between each time their name was spoken. Sometimes the sound would fade for hours, only to return so close to the bed it seemed impossible that there wasn't a mouth just beyond the wall. Other times it would echo faintly from a far part of the house, drawing the mind toward the darkness like a lure. Once, just before dawn, the mother woke to find the whisper of her husband's name filling the room, though the voice was not hers. It was low, almost affectionate, and it came from the wall nearest her side of the bed. She lay motionless, listening, her skin prickling, certain that if she moved, the voice would shift to her own name. The children stopped speaking of the voices aloud. There was no need. Each of them knew the others heard their own name in the night. What none of them knew was why the voices had begun to sound more insistent, less like a passive observation and more like a calling, a beckoning that grew sharper with every repetition. The days brought no relief. Even in daylight, certain corners seemed to hum faintly, as though the voices were whispering too softly to be heard outright, but still close enough to taste the air. The house seemed to draw them toward these places without force, only suggestion, until they found themselves standing near a wall they did not remember approaching, their heartbeats faster for no reason they could name. It was during one such moment, in the late afternoon when the sun's angle turned the upstairs hallway into a narrow tunnel of gold, that the boy pressed his ear against the wall outside the storage room. The whisper was there, waiting. His name slid into the space between his heartbeat and breath, so quiet he almost doubted it, yet so close it felt as though it had bypassed his ears entirely. He stepped back quickly, but the shape of the word seemed to linger in his chest, as if it had been placed there deliberately. From that day on, they all felt the same thing. The voices were no longer content to stay behind the walls. The air between those walls and the living had grown thin, and each name carried with it the faint sense of movement, as though whatever spoke was leaning closer each time it called. And still, the house waited. The first night the voices crossed into their minds was the night the wind died. The stillness outside was unnatural, the air heavy and unmoving, as though the entire world had paused to listen. In that silence, the house breathed for them. It began not with sound, but with a thought that was not their own, a shape in the mind, delicate and cold, carrying their names with such precision that it seemed carved into the marrow. The boy felt it first. He lay in bed, eyes open to the ceiling, when the syllables unfurled inside his head without passing through his ears. They slid into the space where dreams should have been, soft yet inescapable, repeating until the rhythm of them became a pulse. He pressed his palms to his ears, but the sound was untouched, blooming from within. The girl woke to it moments later, her breath quick and shallow. The voice knew her name as though it had always belonged to it, and the thought came with images she could not fully see, shapes moving in shadow, corridors that seemed to stretch downward into the earth. She clutched the blanket to her face, trying to hide from something that was already inside her. In their bedroom, the parents stirred almost at the same moment, each aware of the other's sudden stillness. The father felt his own name moving through his mind with a slow, deliberate persistence. The mother's name followed, not in her head, but in his, as though the voice had grown bold enough to place its words wherever it wished. She turned toward him in the darkness, and the look in her eyes was enough to confirm they were hearing the same thing. The whispers did not fade with the coming of dawn. Instead, they adapted to the light, speaking more softly, but without ceasing. The house no longer needed to wait for nightfall. It had learned the paths inside them. The words came while they unpacked boxes, while they ate, while they walked from room to room. It was no longer the surprise of hearing their name. It was the certainty that the voice was with them always, like a shadow stitched to their thoughts. By the second day, the voices were no longer alone. Images began to accompany them, fleeting glimpses of rooms they did not recognize, glimpses of faces half seen and gone before they could be understood. The children spoke less, their eyes unfocused, as though part of them was walking through those unseen halls. The mother caught herself pausing mid-step, her mind filled with the smell of damp stone and the sound of footsteps not her own. The father tried to fight it. He spoke loudly, moved constantly, kept the television running, though no one watched. But the house had learned his patterns, slipping into the gaps between his words, into the silence beneath the noise. By the third night, he heard the whispers even in his own voice. Each syllable he spoke shaped faintly by the cadence of the thing in the walls. Sleep was no longer a refuge. When they closed their eyes, the rooms of the house rearranged themselves behind their eyelids. The hallways lengthened, the doors multiplied. There were stairs where none existed, leading downward into a darkness that waited with patient hunger. The voices did not call from ahead or behind, but from everywhere at once, guiding them deeper into a place they had never been but somehow recognized. The girl was the first to rise from her bed without remembering doing so. The mother found her at the foot of the staircase in the early hours, her bare feet pale against the wood, her eyes open but unseeing. When touched, she startled as if waking from a dream and claimed she had only been standing there for a moment. But her footprints, faint in the dust on the steps, trailed upward into the darkness above. The boy began to speak less during the day, his lips sometimes moving silently as if answering a question no one had asked aloud. When pressed, he would only look away, the muscles in his jaw tightening. At night, his bed was found in disarray, the covers pushed aside, as though he had risen and returned without knowing. The parents fared no better. More than once, the mother woke to find herself standing in the hallway outside the storage room, the doorknob cold beneath her hand. The father dreamed of opening doors he had never seen in the house, doors that opened onto staircases spiraling endlessly downward. Each time, just before he woke, he would feel a breath at his neck and hear his name one last time, spoken not with menace, but with possession. The days blurred. The clocks seemed unreliable, their ticking inconsistent. Sunlight entered the house strangely, sometimes weaker than it should have been, as though passing through more than glass before reaching them. The voices never tired. They grew layered, overlapping, speaking names in sequences that seemed deliberate but indecipherable. One evening, as the last light faded, the house became utterly silent. The change was so sudden that each of them froze where they stood, straining against the absence. For the first time in days, there was no voice. The quiet was vast and empty, and for a moment they believed it might be over. Then, from somewhere deep below the floor, a single word rose, not a name, but something older, heavier, a word none of them knew yet somehow understood. The floor beneath their feet seemed to shift. The air took on a faint vibration, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. The children moved closer to their parents without being told. The father turned toward the front door, but the moment he stepped forward, the voice returned, not in his head, but all around, in every wall, every floorboard, every breath of air. It spoke all their names at once, layered so perfectly that they could not tell whose was first or last. The sound was not loud, but it was complete, filling them until they could no longer think without thinking in its rhythm. And then, without warning, the light bulbs throughout the house flickered and went out. Darkness swallowed them. The voices remained. They moved now, circling, shifting from one mind to another, never stopping. Footsteps, soft, deliberate, joined them, moving through rooms with impossible speed. Somewhere ahead, a door opened with a slow, aching creak. Cold air swept in, carrying the scent of stone and soil. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. The doorway waited in the dark, though none of them could see it, and the voices grew softer, coaxing, urging movement. They felt themselves drawn forward without knowing who stepped first. The air grew colder. The walls seemed to press closer. When the lights returned, the house was as it had been, the furniture untouched, the rooms the same. But the family stood in the front hallway, each of them facing a different direction, their eyes wide and unfocused. They said nothing, as they turned away from one another, moving silently through the house as though resuming tasks left unfinished. In the days that followed, the voices changed. They no longer called only their names. Sometimes the words were unrecognizable, curling into sounds that did not belong to any language they knew. Other times, they were names the family did not recognize, whispered with the same intimacy, the same certainty. The nights were quieter, but not silent. The house did not need to speak as often now. It had learned something in those dark moments, something that made it patient. The family went about their routines, eyes duller, movements slower, as if listening for something just beyond hearing. On the last morning of October, the front door stood open, though none of them remembered unlocking it. The wind carried leaves across the threshold, scattering them into the hallway. Somewhere deep in the walls, a whisper rose, not loud enough to hear clearly, but enough to turn all four heads toward the same corner of the room. They stared at the plaster as if expecting it to move. The sound faded, leaving only the faint creak of the house settling. One by one, they looked away and returned to what they had been doing. But in the stillness that followed, if one listened closely enough, it was possible to hear faint names spoken in a voice that did not belong to the house at all. Names that belonged to other places, other people. Names that might someday hear the same call. And far away, beyond the trees and the road and the memory of this place, someone turned in their sleep, frowning at the sound of their own name.